All right, good morning, class. Welcome to another of these little impromptu lectures. I hope these videos have been helpful this past week. They're fun to make. They're a bit embarrassing. Nothing worse than watching yourself speak. I guess in introduction to what we're doing this week, I just want to quickly give my 2 cents on this topic. This week, week 2, we're going to be looking a little bit more deeply at changes in the South, and especially in the ways that Southerners interacted with African Americans. It may have been helpful had I delivered part of this presentation last week, but it is what it is. So let me start by posing a question. So when Abraham Lincoln went to Gettysburg and delivered his Gettysburg Address, he ended with that famous line about the government being a government of the people, for the people, by the people, that it shall not perish from the earth. Have you ever stopped and asked yourself, who is or who are the people that Abraham Lincoln was referring to? Right? The government by the people, of the people, for the people. Who were the people? Right, especially in context of our class, when, as we did last week, we've identified that there is, throughout our history, there has been this record of insiders and outsiders. And the insiders are the people within the boundaries. They try to keep themselves within the boundaries. They establish laws, policies, businesses, put themselves into positions of power as a way of building up and protecting their interests. Those people who are not white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, and historically male, everyone who is on the outside, are trying to find ways of blending in order to fit within that group. So when Abraham Lincoln is talking about a government of the people and for the people and by the people, was he referring specifically to that insider group? I want you to think about that. Was he referencing a government of the people, for the people, by the people, a government in any ways representative of African American interests, or for that matter, of any interest outside of that white Anglo-Saxon Protestant worldview? I would argue that as much of a progressive mind as Abraham Lincoln was, at that time, his rhetoric was suggestive of a government of white people, for white people, by white people. And I think that's really important to remember as we're looking closely at the interactions of between, I guess, the racial tensions between North and South, between white and black during this late 19th century. After the Civil War concluded, the United States government passed the 13th Amendment. Section 1 stated that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. What the 13th Amendment did was essentially outlawed, made illegal, any form of servitude, of slavery. But, as progressive as the 13th Amendment was, it left many questions unanswered. For example, what did prohibiting slavery actually prohibit? What exactly was slavery? How is that defined? What are the parameters of slavery? What were the capacities of African Americans as Americans? Okay, if African Americans could no longer be slaves, then what were they to be? What positions would they hold within our country? Where could and should blacks fit in the scheme of American life? Were emancipation from slavery and civil equality for blacks to be synonymous? Right? By simply removing the apparatus of slavery, does that make African Americans equal to this white Anglo-Saxon Protestant insiders group within our country? You see, in the aftermath of the Civil War, this era of Reconstruction, the policies that our government will establish and the way that the North and the South will interact will go a long ways to defining how our nation understood what it meant to be an American citizen, who could have access and who was classified or considered to be an American. And what we'll see is that different groups of people had very different ideas about what an American was. Remember, prior to 1865, nowhere in the United States did African Americans enjoy full civil equality. For instance, if we just look at Supreme Court Justice Roger B. Taney, his response in the 1857 Dred Scott case, he said that African Americans, quote, had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. This is in 1857. And this was universal. He wasn't responding particularly to Southern African Americans, to slaves. He was saying, overall, African Americans had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. So, as I continue in this PowerPoint, when in 1865 U.S. law no longer permitted slavery, many wondered in what capacity U.S. law would recognize African Americans no longer enslaved. Were they American citizens, or were they something else? All right, as I transition here, when we look at the end of slavery and we ask ourselves, well, did anyone have any idea of how African Americans post-slavery would be treated? You know, it was hard. We have never been moved into a post-slavery era within our country, and these types of questions hadn't really come up for debate, except when we consider that slavery had previously been abolished in the northern states 2 or 3 generations earlier. I propose that if we look to see at how African Americans were treated in the North after the first abolition of slavery in the aftermath of the American Revolution, and we look to see how whites in the North treated their African American neighbors, we will get a sense then of how 60, 70 years later, whites in the South would treat their African American neighbors. And there are a ton of parallels. For instance, as historian Leon Litwack wrote, after this first emancipation, this one that took place in the late 18th century, quote, in virtually every phase of existence, African Americans found themselves systematically separated from whites. They were either excluded from railway cars, omnibuses, stagecoaches, and steamboats, or assigned to special Jim Crow sections. They sat in secluded and remote corners of theaters and lecture halls. They could not enter most hotels, restaurants, and resorts except as servants. They prayed in black pews in white churches. We are not describing the South. Again, this is the North in the late 18th, early 19th century. We also see explosions of violence in the North in the immediate aftermath of this first emancipation. Just a couple of examples that have been preserved throughout history. In 1819, a white mob in Philadelphia stoned to death a, quote, uppity African-American woman. In 1829, in Cincinnati, Ohio, rioting whites routed more than 1,000 African Americans from the city, evicting them from homes, kicking them out of the city. In 1832, also in Ohio, whites terrorized a group of freed slaves to stop them from settling in the state. In 1834, in New York City, riots erupted that singled out for attack African American homes and leaders, including the Reverend Peter Williams, who was the very first black priest of the Episcopal Church. So we see that there, in the aftermath of this first emancipation, there is a all-out continued segregation. There's also the creation of violence. Now, as I mentioned, these would be paralleled in the aftermath of the second emancipation after or during the Civil War. Now, for instance, in the immediate aftermath of the war, in 1866, riots in Memphis left 46 blacks and 2 whites dead, 74 others shot, 10 severely beaten. White gangs raped at least 5 black females. Rioters destroyed 12 black schools, 4 black churches, and 91 homes. Why? What was the cause of this riot? It was because freed black ex-slaves were migrating into the cities, causing an imbalance in, white-black ratios, potentially giving the black population more power. And again, going back to this theme, if we have this insider group of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and we have this other group of outsiders trying to find their way within, it is within their interests to keep them out. And so rioting and violence is one of the ways that will happen. There are various other forms of violence and events and places, including New Orleans, in which, in the aftermath of the Civil War, this type of violence took place. But I want to focus the rest of this little short lecture on 2 other important types of violence. First, terror. The groups who employ the ideas of terror or terrorism in order to get their ways. In 1866, in the aftermath of the Memphis riots, a group of white settlers established the Ku Klux Klan. This was a group which continues to exist today. They were white supremacists. They wanted to ensure the white way of life, and did that by terrorizing blacks, stripping them of freedoms, and holding out the threat of lynchings, which is a topic we'll talk much more about. In this image here, you will see that this is a picture of early KKK members. You'll see them huddling here at the bottom of the door, here holding a gun. You'll see one kind of blurrily there in the window looking in. We have this black family sitting around the fireplace. You have the light, you're eating dinner, and here they have come with masks on, aiming gun, meant to terrorize. The second form of violence that we will see popularized in the South in the aftermath of the Civil War and the freedom of the slaves is a form of violence called lynching. Lynchings is a broad term used to describe shootings, hangings, butcherings, burnings, bludgeonings, beatings, mutilations, and dismemberment. This was a form of vigilante violence. These were often lynchings were often used as a form of threat. They were conducted without legal sanctions, and were often used as a way of controlling the vote, of keeping people from voting, or to ensure people voted in a way in common with their interests. Lynchings often went unreported and unprosecuted. It is estimated that between 1882, the years of our study for this week, in 1968, about 3,500 African Americans were lynched. Now, is that number accurate? Probably not. I imagine this number is probably far too low. As I said just a minute ago, lynchings largely went unreported and unprosecuted, and as a result, there is no historical document, no paper trail that we can follow to determine just how many people were lynched. All right, I share this with you because this week, in your reading assignments, I have provided, pull them up here, a couple of source materials, primary source materials, that provide more in-depth discussion and views of ideas of lynchings. I believe lynchings to be clearly a terrible black eye in American history. But because of it, and because they are often overlooked, I think it's important that we spend time examining them. There are two sources that you'll be looking at. The first is an article written by a Walter White, not the Walter White, and I write this in the blog, not the Walter White from Breaking Bad. Walter White was a member of the NAACP who reported into the South, into Georgia, in 1914, 1915, after a bunch of lynchings took place. And he was reporting for audiences in the North exactly what had happened. I will warn you that his account is brutal. His depictions are horrendous and terrible, and often I cannot go reading them or discussing them without tearing up. Again, as a married man with a father of 3 children, to imagine the type of scene that Walter White reports is just, it's terrible. The second source that I'll have you look at is a website called Without Sanctuary. It is hosted by an academic in the South who, in the course of his research, came across hundreds of postcards from the early 20th century depicting scenes of lynchings. I want to be clear. These are postcards. Right? Postcards are things that you take and you send to friends or families. Right? If you go to Disney or you go to Europe, you might send a family member a postcard. You'll write a little inscription on the back, put it in the mail. Look where I was. Look what I did. Right? These are lynching postcards. They are, again, brutal. They are real-life depictions of corpses, of bodies, mutilated, shot, burned. Now, I do this not to be sensational, but I do this because I think it helps us get to the very core, and especially, as we get to the very core of some of these really delicate issues between racial tensions in the past, and especially as we try to connect these racial tensions of the past with what is happening in the present day. Right? Is the shooting of an unarmed black man any different than the lynchings that took place in the 19th century? Right? Is the beating of Rodney King any different than the beating of the people that Walter White sees? I will argue that there is no difference, and that part of the frustration and anger of the Black Lives Matter movement is connecting the current day events with those that have happened in the past. These are not new experiences for this community, but these are experiences that have become common. And if we as a nation, as a country, see these as common, then we are doing a disservice to our fellow Americans. All right, I'll leave that with you a little bit longer today, but this will be my one post for the week. All right, everyone, good luck. Let me know if you have any questions about the assignments. Happy reading.